we're winding down the home stretch. We have 3 more weeks left. And in addition to the lab that's due this Wednesday, we have 2 more labs, which is not a bad proportion, especially when you consider we don't have a final exam or a final project. You could almost consider lab 13 to be your final project. And we're going to spend some time talking about that in class. It might seem a little intimidating at first, but it's the first time I'm trying this particular assignment. So I'll be curious to see how you do. And I am not opposed to curving if there's big problems with it. So don't get uptight about it. Have fun with it. Do your best. That's all anyone can ask. The last topic of this semester is AJAX. And AJAX is discussed in a number of these resources within the module. And I ask that you go and review these. What is AJAX? Simple AJAX tutorial, interactive AJAX tutorial, and a little bit about AJAX and jQuery. A few things about AJAX. Let me show you an example of AJAX, and then we'll talk more specifically about what it is. All right, a classic example of AJAX, in my mind, is when you go to Google's homepage, start typing in something in the search. First of all, notice that you don't even have to start typing something in. Okay, you don't even have to start typing something in order to see something, but that's okay. That could have been the initial load of the page. This information could have appeared. But notice this, as I start typing, let's say I want to do a search on HTML. I type in an H. It gives me the most popular searches that start with H. So Home Depot, Huntington Bank, H&R Block. Not late for that one though, right? As I continue to type T, right, then it shows me HTML, HTTPS, HTS, HTML color codes, and so on. And the more I type in, the more specific the search becomes, and I can pick out what I want from the list. Now let's think about this in terms of the client-server model that we have. And you'll notice something funny is going on here. By funny, I mean something that we haven't really talked about yet. The page initially loads. Put my mouse in there and I get a list of 10 items. That we could code using the knowledge that we have now, right? Because the initial load, we could put a hidden section or hidden nav control and have it populated and have it just made visible when the user puts their mouse in the text box. So that, nothing really funny about that. That could be accomplished through the standard model that we've been talking about so far. But as I start typing in, let's do CSS this time. See, it shows me a list of popular things that start with C. And notice this. A second ago, I was looking for HTML color code, so it's kind of smart enough to know that, gee, I might be interested in color codes, color pickers, color palettes, and so on. All right. Now, this is what I mean by something funny. We can't explain this through the standard client-server interaction that we've had so far, right? Because common sense would dictate that when the page loads, we don't get a repository of all the possible things that you could search for and have those appear via JavaScript. Common sense tells us that this must represent some server activity, that we actually went out to the server, asked for 10 common queries that start with C and got them returned back. All right. And more likely, this looks like a database operation. All right. So we know we can't do client-side database stuff. So this is obviously something in the server. And yet, if you watch very closely, as I type in more, the page doesn't flicker at all. So the page isn't reloading. This is what a page reload looks like in Google. It's not much, but there's a little flicker in it as it refreshes the page from the server. But we don't see that when I start typing in, right? I type in CS. I don't see any kind of flicker. That leads me to believe that the page isn't being reloaded. And so far, whenever we've made a request to the server, it results in getting back an entire web page and then reloading the page. Well, that's not happening here. This is using a combination of server-side scripting and client-side scripting in a different way than we've done before. How do I know there's server-side scripting? Because we couldn't possibly send to the client all the possible things that we could search for and have them appear up. How do I know that there's client-side scripting? There's client-side scripting because the page alters without being reloaded. Remember way back when we started talking about JavaScript, we said that's one of the characteristics. We can alter a page without reloading it. All right, so this is a combination of client and server scripting, but it's not the standard. So let's go and look at what I mean by the standard. And I'm going to draw that old drawing that I always have drawn before. Of the client and the server. We have a client that's connected to the internet. It's connected to web servers. The client makes a request. How do they make a request? By typing a URL in the address bar of the browser, by clicking on a link, by clicking a button, all right, those sorts of things, send a request to the server. And we might send other information. So the request consists of the URL that we want plus other information. The server takes that, does its thing, either retrieves a static page or does its processing like in PHP and produces a web page. Might interact with a database. Might interact with a DB server. Reads the server-side scripts and produces on the fly an HTML document. And the HTML document contains, among other things, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if we're talking about something simple like a mouse over effect, like we saw earlier in the class, that JavaScript got loaded when the page was initially loaded, and that JavaScript can be used to alter the existing page without reloading it. All right, that's all well and good. We understand how that works. However, in this case, we're getting data from a server, and we couldn't have possibly gotten all that data when the page was originally downloaded. So we're making a new request to the server, but we're not making a request that requires a new web page. We're making a request that requires some data. So we're making a different kind of request. And that can consist of a URL plus other stuff. And we get back not a complete HTML document, but we get back data. And the JavaScript then formats that data and redisplays the page. So this process of making a request, getting back data, and using that data to update the page is what AJAX is. AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. All right. AJAX is not a new language. It's just the way we're going to use our client and server-side language in a different way than we have used it so far. We're going to use it. We're going to make requests. We're going to actually have JavaScript code that makes requests to the server under certain circumstances. And then the server is going to respond not with an entire web page, but some data. The JavaScript then takes the data and processes it and does stuff with it. All right. So let's look at our old friend, the old application that we looked at a while ago. All right. Find in there first. All right, Planet Zellers. I've added on this a couple of extra links, and we'll probably spend the rest of the time looking at these two links. One is the calculator. All right, this calculator here. We saw how to do it with a postback. But notice what the postback does. Watch closely. And it's really hard to tell because this is a fast machine and all that, but we're actually reloading the page. We can tell that it reloads by the fact that it now has a different URL. I guess that's proof that it has. We're not getting that flicker with Google because we're not going through the internet. So this happens very quickly. But we can tell that a new page was loaded because we have a different URL up here. So I go type this in and click calculate. All right, we can't tell because I probably used post. Oh, I clicked on calculator AJAX. What am I thinking? This is the one I wanted. So hold that thought that we didn't see the URL change. Here we see the URL change when we use a conventional calculator. All right, so we know that we're reloading that page. And do we see a little flicker? No, not really. But we see the URL change. So we know we're loading the page again. Now, when I do the AJAX calculator, which I've already done, but if you remember back, if not, I'll do it again. When I click on this and I go and enter data in, didn't change the URL, no flicker. That page did not reload. All right. What happened instead? What happened instead is the page, this page, when the button was clicked, the button's not a submit button. So we're not submitting and making a normal HTTP request. By the way, the normal standard request is an HTTP request. Instead, this is a button that triggers some JavaScript.
And what does that JavaScript do? The code actually makes an XML HTTP request. That's the different kind of request. And that's not a request for an entire page, it's a request for some data. Now, AJAX stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. The XML is slightly inaccurate because it doesn't have to be XML coming back from the server. It can be anything. It can be any number of formats, not anything, but it can be any number of formats. It can be just a piece of data, one piece of data. Like in this case, we're getting that string back from the server. All right. It could be a comma delimited file where we have different values separated by commas. It could be a JSON file, JavaScript object notation, or it could be XML data. But the point is we get data back from the server asynchronously. And we'll talk in a minute a little bit about what asynchronously means and how that comes into play here. All right. So let's look at the code here. A question, let me. What does the I stand for again? Yeah, the I stands for the internet. We have the client that's connected through the server, through the internet rather, to the server. So yeah, the I represents the internet. I drew it as a cloud because again, people talk about like internet storage and stuff as cloud storage. So that's why I draw it that way. Yes.
So with this, you're making calls to the data, or not? Are you making calls to a database with this?
I'm not making calls to a database. I'm making calls to the server.
Okay.
The server could potentially make calls to the database. All right, but in this case, this is just a calculation, right? So there's no real need to go and pull data from a database. Your last assignment will require you to write a server-side script that makes a call to a database. All right, and we'll talk about that probably next week. If we have time, we'll talk a little bit about it today, but if not, we'll talk about it next week. Okay, so let's look at this. I have a form, regular old button, not a submit button. And what do buttons do if they're not submit buttons? Buttons send it to the server. Regular buttons invoke some JavaScript. So I say on click process form. So on click is going to call the function process form. And in this one, just to make things a little simpler, I'm not doing any client-side validation. Oh, I am doing client-side validation. My mistake. Process form does client-side validation. It's either going to return a true or a false. Here, the only thing I'm checking for is that they've entered something for the age. If they've entered something for the age and the form is valid, then I'm making the AJAX call. Again, in an actual application, you would validate everything on the client side. All right, so we're going to assume the form is valid. If it's not valid, we've displayed a message and they get a chance to re-enter the data. If the form is valid, however, we call this method make AJAX call. Notice this. Var HTTP equals create request object. And notice that that is outside of any function. That means when the browser scans this page,
it hits that and it's going to create an object in a variable HTTP. Why do you do this? Why not put that in a function? Because we want to share that object across several functions. And the easiest way to do that is make it, it's not really a global variable, but a page level variable, a variable that you can access anywhere within the script tag. So we create a request object. We do that and we have that ready. Yes.
Okay, so it's made as a default kind of to the other methods you're using, like you can get access to it.
We're going to need a request object to do our AJAX request. All right. So we're making one as soon as a page loads because chances are we're going to need it. All right. So we make it right away so that when we need it, we'll be able to use it. All right. So I create the request object. Now this is a nifty little piece of code, which is kind of archaic now. This looks to see if they're running Internet Explorer, because back in the old days, you would create the request object a different way. Now you create the request object this way. Either way, when we're done with this, we've created a request object.
Just omit the explorer.
Yeah, we could. This is an example that got copied over the years. All right. So the bottom line is we have a request object. And it's in this variable called HTTP. Now that request object, strictly speaking, is not an HTTP request. It's an XML HTTP request. So remember what we talked about those being. Those are requests to the server, not for an entire web page, but for a piece of data that we're going to use to update the page. So a request to a server requires a URL. So we're calling this page on the server. Now we'll look at that page in a minute here, and it's actually pretty simple. In AJAX, the server's job becomes a little smaller than it does in conventional application because all the server has to do in AJAX is return the data. So it's not returning an entire web page. So even though it's a PHP file, it's not a full-blown PHP file with HTML tags and all that stuff. All it's doing is outputting the data. We're grabbing those values from the form. We grab the age and the number of beats from the form. We then create our URL by concatenating this with txt age equals, followed by the age, ampersand txt beats equals, and then the number of beats. Let's take a look at that because sometimes this doesn't work, all right, if you have a problem. And if it doesn't work, the first step to do is make sure you're calling the right URL. So I'm going to log it. Let's deliberately mess it up. I'll put txt beat instead of beats. Or no, let's do this. Let's forget the ampersand. That's a nice little error. Let me make sure I'm going to change the right one. Okay, I did. How come it didn't warn me? Anyhow. I go and run this. Gives me this weird error, right? I entered age, right? I entered beats, right? But it's telling me there's no value for beats and they're not numeric. Well, we can look at the console and see what the actual URL was called, because this came from the server, this message. So let's look at the URL that we logged in the console and see check range.php text age equals 21, text beats equals 11. Now, if you remember, how do things look on the query string? They're pairs, where we have the name of the pair, name of the variable, an equal sign, and the value. Then we have an ampersand and the next variable and value. So we can tell by looking at this that, hey, we called the wrong URL. So we can go back into our code, put in the ampersand, and we're back in business. And if you look, the URL shows correctly. With the ampersand in between it. So as your first hint of debugging, if your AJAX code doesn't work, make sure the proper script is being called. All right. So getting back to this, we formulate our URL, we log it, just in case we need to look at it. We then call these three instructions. HTTP, open. It's using that object we created as soon as the page loaded. And what we're doing is we're opening a pipeline between the client and the server. Right? We're making a request path between the client and the server. I like to think of it as a request, or a pipeline. What kind of request are we going to make? We're going to make a GET request. What does GET request mean? It means we're going to pass the data on the URL. All right. What URL are we requesting? Well, the URL that's in the variable URL. Okay. So let's forget this statement for a second. We then go and actually make the request. All right. So forget about this statement for a second. We form the request, we make the request. Why can't we put the code right here to process the data? Well, where are we getting the data from? We're getting the data from the server. How long is the server going to take to return that data? We don't know. All right. Depends on how busy the server is, depending how good your internet connection is. This depends on a lot of stuff, right? So therefore, the data from this, getting back the data from the server is not synchronized with JavaScript.
In other words, we could not immediately go in and start processing the data because we might not have gotten it yet. All right. This has to be asynchronous. All right. Asynchronous means not at the same time. So think if you had a phone call with someone and you were talking to them, that would be synchronous communication. I say something, you say something. You say something, I say something back, and we go back and forth in the conversation. Asynchronous would be something like, I call you, you don't answer, all right, and I leave you a voicemail message. Then you come back and you see you have a voicemail message, you respond to it, and you send me a message back. And therefore, I can't do anything until I get that message back from you, all right? In this case, you're the server. I make a request to you, but it's asynchronous. You're not there to immediately deal with it, all right? You're going to deal with it when you can and return a message back. So therefore, we have to say, whoa, we have to say this. We have to say, on ready state change, call handle response. That is a callback function. What that means is this XML HTTP request object has a state, a ready state. That tells you at what point the request is in. All right. You know, 0 means the request was sent. I don't remember the numbers. 0 through 4, essentially. I think just 0 through 4. We're interested in the status of 4, because the status of 4 means the request has been completed and the data has been sent back to the client. Every time that status changes, we're going to run this function, handle response. And look what this does. Handle response looks at that status and is only interested in the status of 4, right? Because that means that it's finished. The other statuses it disregards. Now, if this was a long request, we might display messages like when it was status 0, when it was status 1, when it was status 2. But something like this is a pretty quick request. So therefore, I don't worry about those previous steps. I just worry about when it's completed. And that is when the ready state equals 4. So when the ready state equals 4, that means that this request that I started here is completed. Therefore, I call this handle response. Handle response knows the status is 4, and it's going to go and find the place on the page with the name results or with the ID of results. And it's going to put in there the value of HTTP response text. So whatever the server responds, that gets put in this HTML. Now let's take a look at the server side code. I include my part inc, which has all the actual calculations in it. I get the age and the beats from the query string. This would, yeah, I would get it from the query string. I initialize the errors to an empty string. I set valid to true. I run through my tests on the server. Finally, if the data is valid, I do this calculation and return one of these 3 messages. If the data is not valid, I return the error. So notice we're not returning like a bunch of HTML. The server should not return HTML in this case. It's up to the client to format the data however we want to format it. We could use this check range AJAX from a number of different programs if we wanted to, a number of different user interfaces. And each one might choose to display the data differently. So therefore, the server's not going to format the response. The server's just going to send back the data. In this case, our data is either an error message or one of those three messages. Now, the second debugging tool is to go in, copy this URL, paste it, and see what it responds with. Returns with a string that says you are in optimal exercise range. We can look at the source code. That's all it returns, is that string. So this is a way to test our server-side code. We know the URL that it's supposed to get, and we can put that URL in our address bar, and we can see exactly the response that you get. Finally, in this case, we're just returning one piece of data. So this is real easy. All we're doing is outputting the data. So that's real straightforward, but in other cases, it might not be quite as straightforward. So I could log the data in case there's like a comma delimited file or whatever to make sure that the data that it got back was correct. There's the URL that was sent. We logged that. There's a response we got back from the server. We can take that URL and test it to make sure it returns the right value. So in this operation, JavaScript's responsible for two things. It's responsible for step 1 and step 3. Server side is responsible for step 2. All right. Step 1 and 3. Step 1 is prepare and make the request to the server. That means get the value from the form if you need value from the form. All right. And then concatenate it and formulate the URL that you need to call on the server. Step 2 is the server processes the request. And that code is just like regular PHP code, in our case, PHP code. It could be other server-sided languages. The difference being is the server-side code is only responsible for returning a piece of data. It's not responsible for returning formatted HTML. So the server returns the data. Step 3 is for JavaScript to take that data and display it. Now, interestingly enough, you've already done AJAX in this class, all right, if you completed the weather example. Because that weather example, you typed in a name of a city, hit submit. It didn't really submit it. It made an AJAX call to the weather server to get some data back. It got data back in JSON format. You took that format and updated the page. The only difference in this case is you only did steps 1 and 3. Someone else did step 2. All right, someone else did the server processing to take what you put in the query string and return the appropriate data. But you did number one, you made the request to it, and you did number three. You took the data back and formatted it. Now I have another example, which is jQuery. AJAX. The result's going to be the same. All right. The server side for this is the identical, right? Because the server side just needs the data to be formatted properly on the URL and call the right script, and it returns the data. The jQuery version of this, however, uses jQuery to format and create the request and so on. So I've put jQuery in here, and this is actually more accurately, this is a mix of JavaScript and jQuery. If the form is valid, then I create my URL, I get the age and the number of beats, I form my URL, then I call that URL, and if there's success, I do this anonymous function. This is called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name, all right? We've just coded the function right into the statement. When would we do that? Well, we'd do that if, if this is not a function we want to reuse. This is something written specifically for this page. And therefore, we wouldn't go through the trouble of creating a function. So we're going to call this, we're going to make this AJAX call. If there's success, we're going to do this. And that's going to take the result and display it on that page. You can, in your mind, if you want to, you can map between the two and see the equivalence. We do something like this, except we use plain old JavaScript. All right, we've done that. All right. This is the equivalent of using this creates XML HTTP object, but we don't have to explicitly create it. It does it for you, and it makes this request. This is the ready state change function that we're only interested in doing if the response has been successful from the server. There probably is a fail function too that you could put in case it got an error from the server. Let's look that up real quick. A lot more stuff in there. Yeah, there's an error option that you can call. It's like we have a success option that you can call. All right, so where do we go from here? All right, what are we going to do with our 2 weeks? We're going to make more involved. We're going to get more involved responses from the server. Client side is going to look oddly familiar in each case. You're going to format the request. It's going to be specific to the problem that you're working on. You're going to take the result from the server, and depending on things, you're going to parse it differently and display it on the page. But the server's going to take the data and maybe do more work to produce the results. We'll go over that in some examples last time. Let me talk about the last assignment though, because it might seem very hard. And I don't want you to feel at all intimidated or anything by it. Just do your best, and I will be very lenient grade-wise. Turn something in so I can give you some credit, in other words. What you need to do is you need to have a form with a customer number on it. HTML document with a customer number. You're going to start entering data. So you're going to enter an A. And what that's going to do is that's going to make a call to a server function. I'm going to call it customer lookup. And I'm going to pass what the user typed into the text box. So I don't have a button to click. I think I made it that, I think the assignment says as soon as you press a key. If I type in AD, it'll send that to the customer lookup. All right. What does a customer lookup do? It's going to query the database. Now we've seen cases of, we've seen queries where we can say select star from customer. That's your one assignment. What we're going to do is we're going to filter out those customers. And I'm going to say where name like. All right. Like means it contains that string. It doesn't have to be equal, in other words. It doesn't have to be exactly equal. Like, for example, AD would match Adams. And it would match Brad, I don't know. It has an AD in it. Yes.
Okay, so it's just like you search an A, you get everything that starts with A. Or
Everything that
ends with A.
contains an A.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And I posted a link that shows the syntax of this in MySQL. But what you're going to get back is you're going to get back your server-side code is going to send back rows of data because it might get more than one. All right. Now, each row is going to contain, let's say, the name. I think I said the name, phone number, and email address. You can look it up. Now, the example next week we'll look at will show you how you can send more than one piece of data and how to process it. Request to the server. If you understand what we went over today, you probably could write that code now. You could write the part that makes the request to the server. All right. The part that you would need to work on, and we'll talk more about this in the last 2 weeks, is writing the code on the server side that pulls out the list of matching customers and then formatting the result that we get back. Because you're going to get back more than one customer. How many customers are going to get back? I don't know. Depends what you type in. So we're going to see how to do that in subsequent weeks. All right. Any questions? Any questions out there in what is this? WebEx land? All right. That's all I had. We'll either see you
in lab, or we will see you next week.